I found out my house had been sold when my own son joked about it over dinner. He said it like it was nothing, like he was talking about the weather or a football game, and for a second I thought I had misheard him. "Mom, you should have seen how fast your house sold," Daniel said with a laugh, leaning back in his chair like he'd just shared something clever. The room felt smaller after that. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of the refrigerator, even the soft jazz Victoria always played in the background, it all faded into something distant and hollow. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't react the way they expected. I just sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way I used to sit during church when I was a girl, still and composed, even when something inside me didn't feel right. Because there was no house sale. Not that I knew of. Not that I had agreed to. And yet the confidence in his voice, the way Victoria avoided my eyes as she reached for her wine glass, told me this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something else. Something that had already happened. Something I had somehow been left out of. I glanced around the dining room, taking in details I had stopped noticing over the years, the polished oak table I helped pick out, the framed photos on the wall, the quiet comfort of a place that had once felt like home. But tonight, it felt staged. Like I was a guest sitting at someone else's table, listening to a conversation I wasn't meant to understand. It was the right time, Victoria added, her tone smooth, practiced. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. Daniel nodded, smiling in that easy way he had when he thought everything was under control. "Market's been crazy. We got a great deal." That word lingered in the air longer than anything else. I kept my face calm, even as something cold settled deep in my chest. I thought about the last few months. The little things I had brushed aside. The way my mail had stopped arriving regularly. The day Daniel insisted on helping with my paperwork, saying it would make things easier for me. The new lock on the side door that I never received. A key for. At the time, I told myself it was just him being protective, trying to take care of me after his father passed. I told myself not to question it. Not to make things difficult. But now, sitting there across from him, watching him laugh about something I didn't understand, I realized how quiet the changes had been. How carefully they had been done. "When did this happen?" I finally asked, my voice steady, almost too steady. Daniel waved a hand dismissively, like the answer didn't matter. "A few months ago. It all went through pretty smoothly. A few months." I nodded slowly, as if I were processing a simple piece of information, as if my entire world hadn't just shifted in a single sentence. I reached for my water glass and took a small sip, giving myself a moment to think, to breathe, to hold everything together. Because reacting now wouldn't give me answers. And I needed answers. More than anything, I needed to understand how something so big could happen without me knowing. How my name, my home, my life could be moved around like a piece on a board I didn't even realize we were playing on. I set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the placemat. "That's interesting," I said quietly. Victoria finally looked at me then, just for a second, and in her eyes I saw something she quickly tried to hide. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something sharper. Calculation. And that was when I knew. Whatever they had done, they believed it was finished. They believed I wouldn't question it. They believed I would accept it the way I had accepted everything else. I gave them a small smile, the kind that doesn't reveal anything, the kind that lets people think they're still in control. But inside, something had already begun to shift. Because if my house had truly been sold, then there had to be a trail. Paperwork. Records. Signatures. And if there was one thing I had learned in 68 years, it was this: the truth doesn't disappear. It just waits for someone patient enough to look for it. I did not bring it up again that night. I finished my dinner slowly, listening more than speaking, letting their words pass over me like background noise. Daniel talked about a new client, something in real estate development, while Victoria nodded along, occasionally adding details that sounded rehearsed. I watched the way they interacted, the subtle glances, the way she would pause just a second before answering, as if measuring every word. When I stood to leave, Daniel kissed my cheek like he always did, quick and distracted. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, already turning back toward the table. Victoria smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the roads were familiar. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, each one casting a brief glow across the dashboard before fading into darkness again. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my thoughts moving carefully, deliberately. I did not allow panic in. Panic clouds judgment. And right now, clarity was the only thing that mattered. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed it immediately. The porch light was off. I always left it on. It was a small thing, but it stood out, like a missing piece in a pattern I had known for years. I stepped out of the car and paused for a moment, listening. The night was quiet, just the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet everything felt slightly off, like walking into a room where someone had moved the furniture by an inch. I reached into my purse for my keys, the familiar weight grounding me. But when I slid the key into the lock, it did not turn. I tried again, slower this time, feeling for resistance. Nothing. The key did not fit. I pulled it out and looked at it under the dim light, as if it might have changed shape without me noticing. It had not. My hand remained steady, even as my mind caught up to what that meant. I walked around to the side door, the one Daniel had insisted on replacing a few months ago. New hardware, he had said. Better security. I remembered thanking him for it. That key did not work either. For a moment, I stood there in the quiet, the cool night air pressing gently against my skin, and I let the realization settle. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a paperwork error. This was deliberate. I took a step back and looked at the house, really looked at it. The windows were dark. The curtains inside were not the ones I had chosen. They were heavier, a darker color, something I would never have picked. My gaze moved slowly, taking in each detail like I was seeing it for the first time. The flower pots I had arranged along the front steps were gone. The small wind chime by the porch, the one my husband had bought years ago, was missing too. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I did not let it rise. Not yet. Instead, I reached for my phone and checked the date. Then I opened my messages, scrolling back through the past few months. There it was. The day Daniel had asked me to sign a few routine documents, telling me it was just to simplify things, to help manage property taxes and maintenance. I remembered sitting at his kitchen table, trusting him, signing where he pointed without reading every line. I had been tired that day. I had not wanted to argue. I closed my eyes briefly, just long enough to acknowledge the mistake, but not long enough to dwell on it. Regret would not change anything now. What mattered was what came next. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my purse. Standing there in the dark, locked out of a place that had once been mine, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had not just made a decision without me. They had erased me from it entirely. And they had done it quietly, step by step, counting on the fact that I would not question them. That I would not look closely. That I would accept whatever version of the truth they chose to give me. I turned away from the house without knocking. There was no point. Whoever was inside, if anyone was inside, was not part of my life anymore. Not tonight. Tonight was not about confrontation. It was about information. About understanding exactly what had been taken, and how. I walked back to my car, each step measured, controlled. When I sat down behind the wheel, I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I placed my hands on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead, letting the silence settle around me. Then I took a slow breath and reached for my phone again, this time searching for something specific. County property records. If my house had been sold, there would be a record. There was always a record. And somewhere in that record would be the truth they thought I would never find. I did not go anywhere that night. I did not call a friend or book a hotel or even turn on the radio. I sat in the driver's seat with my phone in my hand, the screen lighting up my reflection in the dark windshield, and I searched. The county website loaded slowly, each second stretching longer than it should have, but I did not rush it. I had learned a long time ago that rushing only leads to mistakes, and I had already made enough of those. When the property records page finally appeared, I entered my address carefully, making sure every number and letter was correct. My fingers did not shake. My breathing stayed even. I pressed search and waited. The result came up in less than a second. It felt like a door opening quietly, revealing something that had always been there, just out of sight. The property listing appeared with a new owner name. Not mine. Not even Daniel's. A company. I read it once, then again, making sure I was not misunderstanding what I was seeing. The sale date was 6 months ago. 6 months of living my life, paying my bills, walking through rooms that no longer legally belonged to me. 6 months of not knowing. I clicked on the details, scrolling slowly, absorbing each line. There it was. A transfer of ownership. A recorded deed. And attached to it, a digital copy of the signed documents. I opened the file and zoomed in. My name was there. My signature. Neat. Familiar. Undeniable. For a moment, the silence inside the car felt heavier, pressing in from all sides. I stared at the signature, recognizing every curve of the letters, every detail that made it mine. But I did not remember signing this. Not like this. Not knowingly. I went back to the date on the document and matched it with the messages on my phone. The same day Daniel had brought over those papers. The same afternoon he had poured me a cup of coffee and told me not to worry about the details, that he was just helping to organize things for me. I remembered how he had smiled, how easy it had felt to trust him. I remembered how I had not read every page. I had trusted him to tell me what mattered. I leaned back slightly in my seat, letting that realization settle fully into place. This was not a sudden decision. It was a process. A quiet one. Planned carefully. Executed slowly. Piece by piece, until there was nothing left for me to question. I scrolled further down and found the buyer information again. The company name stood out now in a way it had not before. Something about it felt familiar, though I could not place it immediately. I opened a new tab and searched the name. It took a few seconds for the results to load, and when they did, I felt something inside me shift again, sharper this time. The company was registered to a business address I recognized. Not directly. Not in an obvious way. But close enough. A connection. One that led back, not to Daniel, but to Victoria. I sat there very still, reading through the registration details, following the names, the addresses, the links that connected one piece to another. It was not obvious on the surface. It was layered. Structured. Designed to look separate. But it was there. She had not just been involved. She had been central. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in disbelief, but in understanding. The pattern was complete now. Daniel had been the bridge. The trust. The access. Victoria had been the planner. The one who saw the opportunity and shaped it into something real. Together, they had created a situation where everything appeared legal, everything appeared proper, and yet the truth beneath it was something else entirely. I opened my eyes and looked at the screen again, taking in the information one more time, making sure I had not missed anything. Dates. Names. Documents. It was all there. Quiet. Official. Final. At least, that is what they believed. I locked my phone and set it down on the passenger seat, my movements calm and precise. The night around me had not changed. The same streetlights, the same quiet neighborhood, the same house behind me that no longer belonged to me. But something inside me had shifted completely. I was no longer confused. I was no longer guessing. I understood exactly what had been done, and more importantly, how it had been done. And if there was one thing I knew with certainty, it was this. Anything that is built on something hidden can be undone the same way. Slowly. Carefully. Piece by piece. I did not sleep that night. I did not need to. Sleep is for when the mind can rest, and mine had already moved past that. By the time the first light of morning touched the edge of the sky, I had made a decision. Not a loud one. Not the kind people announce. Just a quiet, steady understanding of what needed to be done next. I drove to a small coffee shop just off Main Street, the kind that opens early and stays quiet during the weekday mornings. The air inside smelled like fresh coffee and warm bread, familiar and grounding. I ordered a simple black coffee and chose a table by the window, setting my phone down in front of me like it was part of the plan. Around me, people moved through their routines, checking emails, talking softly, living their lives without knowing how quickly things can change. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth settle into my fingers, and began to think backward. Not about what had happened, but about when it started. The small things came first. The way Victoria had started asking questions about my finances months ago, always framed as concern. Just making sure everything is organized, she had said. Then Daniel offering to help with paperwork, always at the right moment, always when I was tired or distracted. I remembered the day he brought over those documents. The way he flipped through the pages quickly, pointing where I needed to sign, explaining just enough to keep me comfortable but not enough to raise questions. At the time, I had been grateful. Now, I understood the precision behind it. I took a slow sip of coffee and pulled out my phone again, opening the scanned deed. I zoomed in on the signature once more, studying it carefully, not for what it was, but for what it was not. There was no initialing on certain pages. No indication that I had been informed of a sale. Just a clean transfer, presented in a way that looked complete on the surface. I knew enough about paperwork to understand that details matter. Small details. The kind most people overlook. I set the phone down and reached into my purse for a pen and a small notebook I carried with me. I began writing, not in a rush, but in a clear, structured way. Dates. Conversations. Changes I had noticed but dismissed. I wrote down the day the locks were changed. The week my mail began arriving inconsistently. The afternoon Daniel insisted on handling my bank statements. Each memory fit into place like pieces of a larger design I had not seen before. I paused for a moment, looking down at the page, then added one more note. The company name. The connection to Victoria. That was not a coincidence. That was intent. Across the room, someone laughed softly, the sound light and ordinary. I glanced up briefly, then back down at my notes. The contrast between their world and mine did not bother me. It clarified something instead. This was not personal in the way people often think. It was not anger or impulse. It was strategy. And strategy can be understood. It can be traced. I closed the notebook gently and slid it back into my purse. Then I picked up my phone and searched for something specific. Real estate attorney. I did not choose the first name that appeared. I scrolled, reading carefully, looking for experience, for someone who understood property law, someone who dealt with cases that were not simple. I selected a firm a few miles away, one with decades of experience listed clearly on their page. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ring. When the receptionist answered, her voice polite and professional, I spoke calmly, clearly, giving only the necessary information. I would like to schedule a consultation regarding a property transfer that I believe may not have been properly authorized. There was a brief pause, then she offered me an appointment that same afternoon. I accepted without hesitation. After I ended the call, I sat there for a moment longer, finishing my coffee slowly, letting everything settle into place. Nothing about this felt rushed anymore. Not the situation. Not my response. They had taken their time. They had moved quietly, carefully, believing I would not notice until it was too late. But time works both ways. And now, it was mine to use. I stood, placed a few bills on the table, and walked out into the morning light with the same steady pace I had carried all my life. Not because I was unshaken, but because I understood something they did not. This was not over. It had only just begun. I arrived at the law office 10 minutes early. Not because I was anxious, but because I have always believed that showing up prepared is a quiet form of control. The building itself was modest, brick exterior, clean glass doors, the kind of place that does not try to impress but does not need to. Inside, everything was orderly. Neutral tones, framed certificates on the walls, a receptionist who greeted me with a calm professionalism that matched my own. I gave my name and took a seat, placing my purse neatly beside me, my posture straight, my expression composed. Around me, others waited too, each carrying their own version of a problem they had not been able to solve alone. I did not look at them. I did not need to. My focus remained on what I had come here to do. When my name was called, I stood smoothly and followed the assistant down a quiet hallway into a private office. The attorney, a man in his late 50s named Richard Hale, stood to greet me. His handshake was firm, his eyes attentive in a way that told me he was used to listening before speaking. That was a good sign. I sat across from him and placed my phone and notebook on the desk between us, not rushing into explanation, not filling the silence unnecessarily. I had learned that people who speak too quickly often reveal more than they intend. Instead, I waited until he asked the first question. "What can I help you with today, Ms. Collins?" His tone was neutral, open. I met his gaze and answered clearly. I believe my property was sold without my informed consent. There was no drama in my voice, no attempt to exaggerate. Just a statement of fact. He nodded slightly and gestured toward the documents I had brought. "Walk me through what happened." So. I did. Slowly. Precisely. I explained the dinner conversation, the discovery of the property records, the documents I had signed months earlier without full explanation. I showed him the digital deed, pointing out the date, the transfer, the company name. I handed him my notebook, the timeline I had written that morning, each detail organized in a way that made the pattern visible. He did not interrupt. He read carefully, occasionally making a note, his expression thoughtful but controlled. When I finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together as he considered everything I had presented. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was analytical. "You signed the documents," he said finally, not as a question, but as a confirmation. "Yes," I replied. "But I was not informed that I was signing over ownership of my home." He nodded again, this time more slowly. "That distinction matters." He turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen, pulling up the same property record I had found earlier, verifying the details himself. "On the surface, this appears to be a valid transaction," he continued. "However, if you can demonstrate that the signature was obtained under misleading circumstances, or that material information was intentionally withheld, that changes the legal standing significantly." I listened without reacting, absorbing each word carefully. This was not about hope. It was about possibility. And possibility, when structured correctly, becomes strategy. "There is also the matter of the purchasing entity," he added, clicking through additional records. "If there is a direct or indirect connection between the buyer and a party who facilitated the transaction, that could indicate a conflict of interest, or even fraudulent intent." I felt something settle more firmly into place at that moment. Not relief. Not yet. But direction. Clear, defined direction. He looked back at me, his expression steady. "This is not a simple case," he said. "But it is not unwinnable." I held his gaze, my voice as calm as it had been from the beginning. "I am not interested in simple," I said. "I am interested in the truth." For the first time, there was a slight shift in his expression, something that resembled respect. He nodded once. "Then we proceed carefully," he said. "We gather everything. Every document, every communication, every detail. And we build a case that cannot be dismissed." I closed my notebook and placed it back into my purse, my movements deliberate. There was no rush in me anymore. No uncertainty. Just a quiet understanding that what had been taken was not beyond reach. It had simply been hidden behind layers that were now beginning to come apart. When I stood to leave, Richard handed me a list of documents he would need, along with a clear outline of the next steps. I thanked him, not out of politeness, but because clarity deserves acknowledgement. As I stepped back out into the afternoon light, the world looked the same as it had that morning. Cars passed. People walked. Life continued without pause. But for me, something had shifted into place with precision. They had believed the story was already written. That the outcome was fixed. That I would accept what had been done because it appeared official, complete, irreversible. They had underestimated one thing. I do not accept what I do not understand. And now, I understood everything that mattered. I did not contact Daniel the next day, or the day after that. I did not ask questions or demand explanations, because I already understood that answers given too easily are rarely the truth. Instead, I followed the list Richard had given me, one step at a time, gathering everything that could not be argued with. Bank statements, email confirmations, copies of every document I had signed in the past year. I requested records from the bank where Daniel had insisted on helping me consolidate my accounts, and I did it in person, sitting across from a teller who recognized me but did not ask questions. The statements showed transfers I had not fully paid attention to at the time, small adjustments that seemed harmless individually but, when viewed together, formed a pattern that was anything but accidental. I took those records and placed them carefully into a folder, organizing them by date, aligning them with the timeline I had already created. Each piece fit where it should, confirming what I had already begun to see. By the third day, Richard had everything he needed to begin building the case. I returned to his office that afternoon, handing over the folder without hesitation. He reviewed the contents methodically, his attention focused on details most people would overlook. "There is more here than I expected," he said after a moment, his tone measured but firm. He turned one of the statements toward me, pointing to a series of transactions that connected directly to the company that had purchased the house. The same company tied, quietly but undeniably, to Victoria. "These payments," he continued, "indicate a financial relationship prior to the sale. That strengthens the argument that this was coordinated." I nodded, not surprised, only more certain. He then pulled up additional records he had accessed through legal channels, documents I would not have been able to obtain on my own. Corporate filings, ownership structures, names that linked one entity to another in ways designed to remain unnoticed. But they were there, clear once you knew where to look. Victoria's name did not appear directly on the purchase agreement. It appeared one layer behind it, and then another, until the connection became visible in full. "This is intentional," Richard said quietly. "Not just opportunistic. Structured." I listened, my hands resting calmly on the desk, my posture unchanged. "What does that mean for the case?" I asked. He met my gaze directly. "It means we are not just challenging a transaction. We are demonstrating a pattern of deception." The words settled into place with a weight that felt solid, grounded. This was no longer a question of whether something had been done wrong. It was a matter of proving how it had been done and why. Richard explained the next steps in detail. A formal filing. A request for injunction to prevent further transfer or modification of the property. Subpoenas for communication records that could establish intent. Each step precise, each action building toward something larger. "Once this is filed," he said, "they will be notified. They will know you are challenging this." I considered that for a moment, not emotionally, but strategically. "Good," I said simply. He studied me briefly, as if measuring something he had not expected. "Most clients hesitate at this stage," he said. "They worry about the personal consequences." I allowed myself the smallest pause before responding. "This stopped being personal when they made it deliberate," I replied. There was nothing more to add to that. The meeting concluded with signatures, this time read carefully, each page reviewed in full, every line understood before I placed my name on it. When I left the office, the air outside felt sharper, clearer. Not because anything had been resolved, but because everything was now in motion. Later that evening, I sat in a quiet hotel room I had checked into earlier that day, the folder of copies resting on the small desk by the window. The room was simple, neutral, temporary. It did not carry memories, and that was exactly what I needed. My phone remained silent for most of the evening, until just after 7. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Mom, I tried calling earlier," he said, his voice casual, but there was something beneath it now. Something less certain. "Where have you been?" I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. "Taking care of something important," I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end. "We should talk," he added, a slight edge entering his tone. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. "We will," I said. "Soon." I ended the call before he could respond further, setting the phone down gently on the table. The silence that followed was not empty. It was controlled. Because for the first time since that dinner, the balance had shifted. They knew something was different now. They could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. And that uncertainty, that quiet awareness that something was no longer in their control, was the beginning of everything changing. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a gradual shift from darkness to light that filled the room in slow, steady increments. I had already been awake for some time, seated at the small desk with the folder open in front of me, reviewing each document again not because I needed to, but because repetition builds certainty. There is a difference between knowing something and being prepared to prove it, and I intended to be prepared. At exactly 9:15, my phone rang. This time, it was not Daniel. It was Victoria. I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of control. "Margaret," she said, her voice carefully measured, each syllable placed with intention. "Daniel mentioned you have been busy." I did not respond to the tone beneath her words. I focused only on what was said. "I have been taking care of what needs to be taken care of," I replied calmly. There was a brief silence, the kind that usually invites explanation. I did not offer one. "We should meet," she continued, her voice tightening just slightly. "There seems to be some confusion." I looked down at the documents in front of me, my finger resting lightly on the edge of the recorded deed. Confusion. That was an interesting choice of word. "There is no confusion," I said evenly. "But we can meet." Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear her adjusting her approach, recalculating. "This afternoon," she said finally. "At the house." I allowed a small moment to pass before answering. "No," I said. "We will meet somewhere neutral." I did not explain why. I did not need to. Control of the setting matters. "Fine," she replied after a second. 3:00. The cafe on Elm Street. 3:00, I confirmed, and ended the call. I closed the folder and stood, moving with the same steady rhythm I had carried through the past few days. When I arrived at the cafe, I chose a table where I could see the entrance clearly. Not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Awareness is not fear. It is preparation. Victoria arrived precisely on time, her appearance as polished as ever, her posture confident, her expression composed. Daniel followed a step behind her, his usual ease replaced with something less certain, something closer to tension. They sat across from me, and for a moment, no one spoke. The air between us was not heavy. It was sharp. Defined. "Margaret," Victoria began, folding her hands neatly on the table, "we think there has been a misunderstanding regarding the property." I met her gaze without reacting. "No," I said simply. "There has not." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, leaning forward as if to soften the moment. "Mom, we were trying to help," he said. "You know the house was getting to be too much. The maintenance, the costs," I let him finish. Not because I needed to hear it, but because people reveal more when they believe they are explaining themselves. "You signed the documents," he added, his voice more insistent now. "Everything was done properly." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "I signed documents," I said calmly. I was not informed that I was signing over ownership of my home. Victoria's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened, just slightly. "The paperwork was clear," she said. "If you chose not to read it thoroughly, that is not our responsibility." There it was. Not apology. Not concern. Positioning. I allowed a small silence to follow, giving her words space to settle. Then I reached into my purse and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Not the full file. Just enough. "This is the recorded deed," I said. "And this," I added, placing a second page beside it, "is the corporate registration of the purchasing entity." Daniel glanced down, his eyes moving quickly across the page, his expression tightening as recognition set in. Victoria did not look immediately. She waited a second too long, then lowered her gaze, her composure holding but no longer effortless. "The connection is clear," I continued, my voice even, unhurried. "Financial records confirm it. Timelines support it. This was not assistance. This was coordination. The table fell silent. The noise of the cafe continued around us, cups clinking, conversations blending together, but at that table, everything narrowed to a single point. Daniel looked up first, something unsettled now visible in his expression. "What are you saying?" he asked, though I suspected he already knew. I met his eyes, steady and direct. "I am saying," I replied, "that this is no longer a private matter." Victoria's hand moved slightly, resting on the edge of the table, her fingers still, controlled. "You are overreacting," she said, but the certainty in her voice had thinned. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. "No," I said quietly. "I am responding." I gathered the papers back into my purse, standing with the same calm precision I had maintained from the beginning. "You will be contacted formally," I added, not as a threat, but as a statement. Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Victoria remained seated, her posture unchanged, but something in her stillness had shifted. I did not wait for either of them to respond. I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving them exactly where they were, with just enough information to understand what was coming, but not enough to stop it. And for the first time since that dinner, I could see it clearly. They were no longer in control of the story they had written. The filing was submitted the next morning. Richard handled it with the same precision he had shown from the beginning, every document reviewed, every statement aligned with the evidence we had gathered. I was present, not because I needed to be, but because I chose to be. There is a difference between being represented and being aware, and I intended to remain aware of every step. The courthouse itself was exactly what I expected. High ceilings, polished floors, the quiet echo of footsteps moving with purpose. It was not intimidating. It was structured. And structure favors those who are prepared. We sat in a small waiting area outside the assigned courtroom, the file resting neatly in Richard's hands. Around us, people spoke in low voices, attorneys reviewing notes, clients asking questions they should have asked days earlier. I remained silent, my focus steady, my attention fixed on what mattered. When Daniel and Victoria arrived, I noticed the shift immediately. Daniel's posture was tighter than before, his usual confidence replaced by something less certain. Victoria, on the other hand, held herself with the same composed exterior, but I had already learned to look past that. Control is often maintained until it is tested. This was the moment of testing. They did not approach me. They sat across the room, speaking quietly to their attorney, a man I did not recognize but whose expression suggested he had been given only part of the story. That, too, mattered. Partial truth leads to incomplete defense. When our case was called, we entered the courtroom together, the space calm and orderly, the judge already seated, reviewing the docket. I took my place beside Richard, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. There was no need for outward emotion. This was not about how I felt. It was about what could be proven. The proceedings began with formalities, names stated, representation confirmed. Then Richard stood, his voice clear and measured as he presented the initial argument. He did not dramatize. He did not exaggerate. He laid out the facts exactly as they were, building the narrative step by step. The transfer of property. The lack of informed consent. The connection between the purchasing entity and Victoria. Each point supported by documentation, each claim grounded in evidence that could not be dismissed. I watched as the judge reviewed the materials, her expression neutral but attentive, her questions precise. She asked about the signing of the documents, about the relationship between the parties, about the timeline. Richard answered each one without hesitation, referencing the documents we had prepared, guiding the focus exactly where it needed to be. Then it was their turn. Their attorney stood, presenting their position with confidence, emphasizing the signed documents, the legality of the transaction on its surface. He spoke about responsibility, about due diligence, about the assumption that a signature indicates understanding. It was a clean argument. Simple. And incomplete. When the judge asked about the purchasing entity, there was a brief pause. Not long. Just enough. Their attorney referenced the company as an independent party, separate from the transaction itself. That was the moment Richard had prepared for. He stood again, requesting permission to submit additional documentation. The corporate filings. The financial records. The connections that had been layered carefully, now laid out clearly. The judge reviewed them in silence, her attention focused, her expression unchanged but her questions shifting. She asked Victoria directly about her relationship to the company. Victoria answered calmly, acknowledging a limited connection, framing it as incidental, not influential. But the documents did not support that version. They showed involvement, structure, intent. The room remained quiet, but the direction of the conversation had changed. Daniel spoke next, his voice less steady than before, repeating the idea that everything had been done to help, that there was no intention to deceive. I listened without reacting, not because his words did not matter, but because they no longer carried weight against what had been presented. The judge leaned back slightly, reviewing her notes, the documents, the sequence of events now fully visible. When she spoke again, her tone was firm, controlled, definitive. She acknowledged that while the documents appeared valid at first glance, the evidence suggested that material information had not been fully disclosed and that there was a significant conflict of interest in the transaction. She granted the injunction, halting any further action on the property until a full hearing could be conducted. It was not the final decision. But it was enough. Enough to stop them. Enough to shift everything. As we stepped out of the courtroom, the air felt the same, but the balance had changed completely. Daniel avoided my eyes. Victoria did not. She looked at me directly, her expression still composed, but something beneath it had fractured. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But enough. I did not speak to them. I did not need to. The outcome of that moment spoke clearly enough. This was no longer something they could control quietly. It had moved into a space where truth is examined, where details matter, where intention cannot be hidden behind polished explanations. And for the first time since this began, they were no longer ahead of it. They were responding to it. The weeks that followed did not unfold with drama or raised voices. They moved quietly, guided by filings, responses, and a series of carefully scheduled hearings that carried more weight than any conversation ever could. I attended each one with the same steady presence, sitting beside Richard, listening as the structure we had built continued to hold. Evidence was introduced in layers, each document reinforcing the last, each connection making the overall picture clearer, sharper, harder to deny. Daniel spoke less with each passing session. The certainty he once carried had thinned, replaced by hesitation that showed in the way he avoided direct answers, in the way his attorney had to guide him back to the point more than once. Victoria remained composed longer, her responses measured, her tone controlled, but even that began to shift as the details accumulated. Precision has a way of revealing what confidence alone cannot sustain. By the time the final hearing arrived, there was no longer any ambiguity about what had happened. The timeline was established. The financial connections were documented. The structure of the transaction, once layered and obscured, had been fully brought into view. The courtroom felt quieter that day, not because fewer people were present, but because the outcome had already begun to take shape in the space between the facts and the silence that followed them. When the judge spoke, her words were direct, grounded entirely in what had been demonstrated. She stated that the transfer of the property had been executed under circumstances that did not meet the standard of informed consent, and that the involvement of a connected entity introduced a conflict that undermined the legitimacy of the transaction. The sale was voided. Ownership was restored. The legal language was precise, but the meaning was simple. What had been taken was returned. There was no reaction from me. No visible release, no outward acknowledgement beyond a single, steady breath. Across the room, Daniel sat still, his expression unreadable, as if he was trying to process something that no longer fit within the version of events he had accepted. Victoria's composure remained, but it no longer carried the same certainty. It had become something else. Contained, but altered. When the session concluded, people began to move again, chairs shifting, papers gathered, conversations resuming in low voices. I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the finality of it to settle not as emotion, but as fact. Then I stood, thanked Richard quietly, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Outside, the air felt clean, the afternoon light steady and unchanged, as if the world had not paused for any of it. I returned to the house later that day, not with urgency, but with intention. The driveway was the same. The structure unchanged. But as I approached the front door, I noticed the small details again. The absence of the wind chime. The difference in the curtains. The subtle signs that someone else had tried to reshape what had once been mine. I unlocked the door with the key Richard had ensured was restored to me, the mechanism turning smoothly this time, without resistance. Inside, the space felt both familiar and distant, like a place remembered clearly but seen through a different lens. I walked through each room slowly, not searching for anything, just observing. Taking in what remained, what had been altered, what could be set right and what would be left as it was. Some things, once changed, do not need to be returned to their original state. They simply need to be understood. I did not call Daniel. I did not send a message. There was nothing left to explain. The process had spoken clearly enough. The boundaries had been redrawn not through words, but through action that could not be undone or ignored. As the evening light settled across the floor, I stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the same street I had known for years. The same quiet rhythm. The same passing cars. Everything appeared unchanged, and yet everything was different in the only way that mattered. They had not just lost control of the situation. They had lost the assumption that I would remain silent within it. And that was something no court could restore for them.